Naval Station Guantanamo Bay is the only military base that the United States maintains in a socialist country. Located on the shores of southeastern Cuba, the land that the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base sits on has been leased from Cuba by the United States since 1903. It's a very complicated landlord-tenant relationship. More on that later. To fully understand the history of the base, also known as Gitmo, you have to go all the way back to the Spanish-American War in 1898. Back in the late 1800s, Cuba was fighting against Spain for independence against Spanish colonial rule. The U.S. sided with Cuba and loved the idea of pushing the Spanish Empire completely out of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. joined the fight against Spain after a mysterious explosion on the USS Maine that killed 268, or three-quarters of the crew. The blast sent the Maine to the bottom of the Havana harbor and was a main catalyst to America declaring war on Spain. The term "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain" became a rallying cry for those who wanted action against the Spanish. It's still not certain if the explosion on the Maine was caused by an internal accident or by the Spanish Empire. Either way, the Spanish-American War had begun. The U.S., looking for a place to protect their fleet during the hurricane season of 1898, landed Marines at Guantanamo Bay with naval support. The joint American-Cuban forces routed the defending Spanish troops in the Battle of Guantanamo Bay. This began the American military presence in the bay that they would never relinquish. The war ended with an American victory and a peace treaty in which Spain formally relinquished control of Cuba back to the Cubans. Under the treaty, Spain relinquished control of the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, along with other islands in the West Indies, to the United States. The treaty marked the end of the Spanish Empire and marked the beginning of the U.S. as a world power. Although the war was over, the United States maintained a strong military presence on the island of Cuba. In 1901, the U.S. government passed the Platt Amendment, which permitted extensive U.S. involvement in Cuban affairs and allowed the U.S. to lease lands from Cuba for naval stations in order to protect the independence of Cuba and their own interest. After initial resistance by the Cuban government, the Platt Amendment was incorporated into the Cuban Constitution in 1901, and land for a naval base at Guantanamo Bay was leased to the U.S. in 1903, starting one of the more bizarre tenant-landlord relationships ever. The lease of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base has no expiration date and can really only end when the U.S. decides to end it. The annual rent payment was set at a $2,000 gold coin, which the U.S. changed over to U.S. dollars and is based off the price of gold. The annual lease payment has slowly risen throughout the years to a little over $4,000 currently. But it didn't matter much since the Cuban government stopped accepting lease payments from the United States after the Cuban Revolution. Since 1959, the Cuban Communist government has consistently protested against the U.S. presence on Cuban soil. The history of Guantanamo Bay can be broken up into two parts: pre-Castro or Cuban Revolution and the post-Castro Cuban Revolution period. Before Castro took over power, the base was an economic hub for the Cubans living in the area, with many Cubans working on the base. A lot of U.S. soldiers also enjoyed life outside the base, especially the nightlife, with local clubs, hotels, bars, and brothels being frequented by Americans from the base, generating a lot of money for local businesses. The base has been used in various ways throughout the years. In the early 1900s, the base was primarily used as a coaling station. In the lead up to World War II, the naval base quickly expanded and became a prime area for winter training for the Atlantic Fleet. In the late 50s, with the rise of the Cold War and Castro taking control of the island, life on the base quickly changed. The flow of people in and out of the base became heavily restricted, hurting the local economy. Vehicular traffic coming into the base was stopped, and thousands of Cubans who worked on the base were required to walk through the base's several gates. The Cuban government banned any new recruitments to work on the base in 1959. By the turn of the century, there were only a small number of older Cubans that crossed the base's northeast gate daily to work on the base. They have all since retired, being the last Cubans to commute into the base for work. After that, some still came to the gate each week to collect their pension checks. The border between the base and Cuba was dubbed the Cactus Curtain after the Cuban Revolution because the Cuban army planted an 8-mile long, 10-foot wide barrier of cactus to prevent economic migrants fleeing from Cuba to get to Gitmo. The curtain forms part of the no man's land that encircles the base. The area is complete with perimeter patrols, watchtowers, and has been complemented with barbed wire fences and minefields. The U.S. and Cuban troops placed about 55,000 landmines across no man's land around the perimeter of the naval base, creating the largest minefield in the Western Hemisphere. In 1996, President Clinton ordered the removal of the American mines. Most of the Cuban mines are still in place. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, families of military personnel on the base had to be quickly evacuated off the island. After the crisis was resolved, they were allowed to return to the base. In 1964, the Cuban government cut off the water supply to the base, further deteriorating the landlord-tenant relationship. At the time, water was coming in via a pipeline from a local river. The U.S. started to import water on barges from Jamaica until a desalination plant could be relocated onto the base. Since 2002, the naval base has contained a highly controversial and notorious detention center used for terror suspects, which has been a subject of many protests due to the suspected treatment of the detainees. Today, many Cuban citizens oppose the base for many reasons, especially the locals that live close to the base. The base is oftentimes an irritant to locals. There are still some Cuban security checkpoints as you get closer to the base, which hurts local tourism. They complain that the money spent by the Cuban government on security due to the American presence on the island could be better spent on improving the day-to-day lives of Cubans. Local fishermen complain that the best fishing areas closer to the base are off limits to them. Even though the U.S. controls the outer part of both sides of the bay, Cuban commercial vessels are allowed in and out of the bay, but are restricted to where they can go. Relations between the two militaries aren't exactly friendly these days, but they're a lot better than they were during the height of the Cold War, when bullets would occasionally fly back and forth through no man's land. Small military delegations from both sides meet monthly to discuss local military matters and have held joint drills to practice for natural disasters. Today, there are thousands of sailors and Marines stationed at Gitmo. Cubans argue that many current activities on the base are not allowed under the lease terms, like the military prison. And even though parts of the lease prohibits commercial and other enterprises on the land, several franchises are owned and operated by the Navy on the base. The notoriety and mystique of the base has led it to be featured in many popular films throughout the years. Relations between the countries remain fragile, and it will be interesting to see what the future holds for the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. Given the history with Cuba and the location of the base, I don't see the United States giving it up anytime soon. As always, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Please subscribe for more historical videos. Take care.